Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Really excited to have Steve Joordens on the show today. Steve is a professor of psychology at University of Toronto. Steve's also the director of the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab. He's a really fascinating speaker. I've seen his talks online a bunch, and I was fortunate enough to be in a webinar with Steve recently. We got plenty to talk to Steve about, but before we get to any of that, I just want to welcome Steve to the show. So Steve, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you. Great to be here. I feel like I've made it now.
Exactly. This is it. You've truly arrived. We always like to begin by getting to know our guests a little bit more. I like to talk about their origin story. What got you to this point in your career?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in a small military base in Israel. I'm kind of multicultural. There's a British Air Force base in Germany, and I have Canadian parents of Dutch descent.
Wow.
So I'm multicultural if you count all parts of Europe as multicultural. As a graduate school, I studied memory and human consciousness. So I was a cognitive psychologist doing a lot of real lab-based kind of work. And I quite enjoyed it. But then I started teaching, and I love teaching. I absolutely, the whole experience was fantastic. And over time, I started to think that's where I wanted my research to be too. And especially because I was teaching large classes, online classes. So I was really playing with that technology envelope. And that made me really want to think, how can we up our game in this context? Which led to that lab being created, the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab. And basically what we do there is we scour the educational psych literature for things that seem to work. And then we try to embody them in technologies so that they can be scaled, used at scale. And we do a whole lot of research on the tech as we do it just to make sure it works like we say, it's usable, all that kind of stuff. So it's a real fun lab. And now suddenly with e-learning, the thing, it's like we're in the right place at the right time. Obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of the right fable or fairy tale that this is analogous to. Maybe it's Cinderella, right? It might be a Cinderella story where e-learning had always been keeping it real, focused on the future of learning. And there is some opportunity to find the people who know what's going on a little bit more, like yourself, and then lean on them to help us get further faster.
Yeah, there's a fun analogy I like to throw out there that I haven't heard that commonly said now, but it's in the COVID world, we say we want the medical experts and the scientists to lead, and we want the leaders, the politician type leaders, to take a bit of a backseat. And these people who are in the online world, and especially in the centers of teaching and learning, they are about the science of learning. They've known the challenges of online learning for some time. They've taken them very seriously. They've done research and such to try to find optimal methods. They've been doing that for a long time. And I would love to see universities have that same mentality where, at least in terms of the online offerings, that suddenly these people who know the science of learning are given a little bit of a leadership role to help guide all my other analogy, all the new immigrants that are now coming from the traditional education world and thrown into the online world.
Yeah. And I think we were likening it to a bit of a stampede at one point too. That again took me to the plains of the Serengeti, and suddenly the non-digitally fluent instructors were just rambling through. It was a tough spring, and just getting through. That's why the point about social emotional wellness is so critical nowadays. How has that come into play really over the years when you're thinking about advanced learning technologies? You also talked about embodying technology, so like wearing it and making it human and connected.
One of the primary passions I have in this space is trying to push us to take skill development much more seriously. We've been very good at, I think, transmitting information to students for a long time. But even before COVID, we knew that their success was ultimately determined by their ability to do things like think critically and think creatively, communicate, those sort of human interaction. For me, the ultimate thing I think about with my students sometimes is them sitting in an interview. And that's the ultimate test they have in the real world. Can they, impress people? Can they interact with a way where that person talking to them says, hey, I want them part of our team? And I'm thinking ahead to that, and have been for a long time, and have been trying to think how, for example, with my 1,600 student intro to psychology class, which is what I teach, how can you work with a class like that and start working on those skills, at least at a foundational level? And how can technology help you do that 1,600 students at a time? So I've been wrestling with that for a few years already, simply because I love these large classes. And so the question is how to be effective. But now, of course, this is a central problem in general because students used to get a lot of practice with those skills in the hallways,
Right.
in their student-to-student interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's such a sterile world where they're sitting in front of their computer and sometimes just listening. And so that's suboptimal. And I think we really need ways to humanize and connect students. And I think that's a great challenge that we'll have going forward, is to make e-learning warm and fuzzy and to make the people who engage in it better at interacting in the sort of ways you do every day, just interacting with strangers and talking and trying to have a great conversation.
Yeah, exactly. The behaviors that you have to get very specific about are very different than what we traditionally learn in school. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the technologies that we have that I like a lot is something called Peer Scholar. And the way it works is the following. Students are first given some task, compose something and whatever you want to do. And so they do that and submit it. But then it's all about them learning first to give feedback to peers.
Yes.
And so we're putting them right in the role and we're saying, you know what, we're going to promote you to the teacher role now. And you're going to see what some of your peers submitted anonymously. And we want you to critically analyze each piece and to ultimately give this peer some idea of how they can improve their work.
Yep.
And this is a hard thing, by the way. And so we get a real opportunity for teaching them, well, what does good feedback look like? So we include some micro learning. But the important thing is they learn and then they immediately practice in a real world context.
Yeah.
And as I'll get to in a moment, they're eventually going to get feedback on their feedback.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be able to see the impact that their words had on others down the road, just to flesh out that process. The second step, they're giving feedback. But then the third step, they've received a bunch of feedback on their own work.
Yeah.
And really a critical communication thing that we don't talk about enough is the ability to shut up and listen.
Oh my God.
Somebody else.
My wife may have mentioned that on occasion. Yeah.
That notion of active listening, it's hard when people are criticizing us, because when they're criticizing us, it feels like an attack. When we feel like we're being attacked, we want to fight and flee. Educators, we want people to sit, think, and learn. And that's not natural. And so once again, we can really walk them through this process. We make them analyze the feedback so we know they engage with it, ask them a bunch of questions. And then ultimately, we even ask them questions about the quality of the feedback. Did this person, we taught you what good feedback looks like? What do you think they did? And so they're getting a really rich idea of communication from both sides and the emotional impact that when someone is overly critical, that they feel it. And I'll often get them to acknowledge those emotions. And it's all in a real context, because ultimately, they're going to get all this feedback, and then they're going to be given the chance to improve their work before the prof sees it. And so they can actually use this. And that's a really critical thing, because what students tell me over and over again is, wow, this was a lot of work. But when I actually fixed my thing and looked at it, it was better. And when I knew it was better, it was worth it all. So they're learning what Carol Dweck would call that sort of growth mindset, that idea of nothing's ever done, everything can always be improved. And I think sometimes we work against ourselves with our deadlines. We get this impression that when it's done. And so that's the kind of context. And what it feels like to students, we've shown that it enhances their sense of community, because they feel like, okay, I'm in a 1,600 student class, but suddenly I'm in this community of 5 or 6 students who are trying to help each other. And it's almost a Socratic kind of experience for them. And they really feel like that makes them more connected to the other students. Now, I do want to point out that there's a real difference between that, in the sense that it's not real time and it's not face to face. And so it's a little away from that interview, which is the ultimate goal. But this is how you can lay the foundations with digital experience, and you can get them thinking critically about what they're listening to, and thinking creatively about how it can be better. And when they get the sort of foundations of those skills, then I think they're better ready for experiential learning, or something where they're using them in the real world in real time. And so it's a way to get from where they are to there.
The way to get your first job is to show that you can take feedback.
Let me give you an example. One of the things I say to students, so a lot of them have interviewed for something, and I said, okay, you made the interview, you got a formal interview, you didn't get the job. What did you do then? And the usual answer is, well, nothing. I had a beer or something because I wasn't happy I didn't get the job. When I say what you just had was a bunch of people who formally evaluated you and compared you to other potential candidates, and they chose somebody else. you love to know why?
Yeah.
What if you got back in touch with them and said, hey, listen, I know I didn't get the job. I'm not complaining about that. That's all really cool. But there might be a job down the line.
Yeah.
And so given you formally assessed me, was it possible I could talk to somebody who had
Yeah.
some information
Mm-hmm.
that I could use to grow? So that does two things. One, if it's honest and you're going to use that to grow, cool. That's the right mindset to have. The second thing is it tells that company,
Yeah.
this is a person that wants to grow and learn and get better.
Yeah.
And maybe there is a job around the corner.
Right.
And maybe they say, hey, why don't you come back in for this?
Because frequently there's just a better candidate. I've been on the other side of a lot of hiring decisions, and I've wanted to hire 3 or 4 different people. Best case, that's why you're frequently brought back in for multiple interviews, is that they like you, but they're trying to figure out who would be the really best fit for this job. Yeah. Also, just simple courtesies and not transgressing in terms of social engagement are foundational. They're just disqualifiers if you show up late. It's like the old football coach on time is 15 minutes early. Tom Coughlin for the Giants. If you show up at 9 o'clock for a 9 o'clock meeting, you're at least 5 minutes late. And the same thing for a job interview. But these are all nonverbal signals, nonverbal feedback. Do you have any thoughts on how that changes in an online environment?
There are certainly tools now, and I use one of them. There's a company called Top Hat in Toronto. When I teach with my full class in front of me, and my full class isn't 1,600, it's about 400, and I'm videotaped and some watch online.
Yeah.
But those that are there can use this response technology that's becoming pretty sophisticated, where I can query the class in various ways, and they can respond to me. They also have a question chat going in the background, where they can upvote each other's questions. And so every now and then I can just take a breath, look at my phone, and see the questions that are on lots of people's minds.
Yeah.
So things like that allow it to become a little more of a discussion, even in a large class, without the chaos that would happen if people were raising hands and doing whatever. It's always a little different. But I am interested in creeping up on that line too. So as one example, let's go back to the interview, because I love that as the ultimate test. We're having a version of an activity within our technology where students show up and they just see a video, and they play that video, and that video is somebody asking them a question. And then when that video stops, their mic opens and they have to answer that question. And it starts right from the stop of the question. So they have to answer it in real time. They don't know the question ahead of time. It's randomly selected from a large pool of questions. And so they have to immediately try to answer. And then they peer assess each other's answers. So I see how you answered. And maybe I think, oh, wow, he hit a point I should have hit. That's okay, I see it. And that's part of the peer assessment, is you see all these different responses. But that's an example of how still in the digital world, we can get much closer to the real-time, face-to-face human experience, and you can creep progressively there. And I think that's what we have to do with our students, because these skills, there's the notion that Vygotsky talks about his zone of proximal development. And I think a lot of our students feel like they're thrown into an interview and they don't know anything about those skills they need to succeed in an interview. So it becomes something they feel like, I can't pass this. It's too far outside of their zone. Right. And they end up feeling maybe helpless, maybe depressed, maybe whatever.
Right.
So that's where I think in the education system, we have them for 4 years.
Right.
It's like a gym in my mind, where we have 4 years to train them on these skills. If we do it regularly and in a structured way, and if we can creep them along that zone of proximal development and by giving them, tougher and tougher tasks to meet, then we can put them in a position where that interview is within their zone. They may still learn, obviously, but they're ready for it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It reminds me of the concept of desirable difficulty, where you want to be challenged enough, but you don't want to be like Seligman's depressed dogs who couldn't. That's such a look it up when you want to be depressed and get a little bit of history. But Seligman's depression. Please, you're the psychology expert. I just dropped the thought bomb. Yeah.
So this is a weird. I just find myself in this weird space where I thought of myself as the ed tech guy, but at the beginning of COVID, I've lectured on anxiety and such a lot. So I created a free online course just to let people understand what they're feeling. And threw that out there. And that's all about anxiety. But there's a worry right now in COVID, they're very close to Seligman, that some of our anxieties could turn to depression. And that's worrisome. And the key that Seligman talked about was this notion of what he called learned helplessness. So I hate this study too. I'm a dog lover. But I'll do it really carefully, because once you hear it, it sticks in your mind and you can't lose it. So he would have this chamber, with two sides and a potential thing that could block it in the middle. And originally on, the dogs were trained in a very simple thing, that when a light went on one of the sides, shortly thereafter, the floor was going to get a little electrocuted, a little electric.
Yeah.
Not enough to actually cause any physical harm, but we all hate that feeling,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
dogs
Yeah.
hate that feeling. So they very quickly learned, when a light goes on, get to the other side of the chamber. That was step one. Step two is where it gets nasty and a little uncomfortable. They increase the barrier now to a level where the dog can no longer escape.
Yeah.
And so now the light comes on, and the first few trials, the dog tries really hard to escape. But it learns after a while that it can't. And it ends up curling up in the corner, light goes on, takes the shock, and it just sits there. Now, the third phase that's really scary is when you now remove the barrier. And what you find is, when you continue the procedure, even though the dog could escape, it fails to try. And so that's the claim of learned helplessness. My worry in COVID, and I don't know how anxiety versus these forces will play out, but is that when we feel like we've been trying everything, we've been wearing our mask, we've been doing whatever, and it's still coming back and it's still hitting us. It feels a little Seligman. And I do worry that we might reach a point, which some people call COVID fatigue or whatever, where it's like, well, why bother? Why even bother doing these things? And that could make the virus even worse. It could potentially lead to depression, although there's other reasons to think we might not get depressed, and I haven't seen a lot of it. But
But it's vivid imagery there, and it is something that will stick in your mind. And I guess the idea is keep struggling, keep fighting, really, no matter what. And then also having the will to push is actually something we all need to muster, and we can rely on each other to help inspire and find that motivation. Can you talk also about motivation? Because motivation is a big part of teaching, and applying that to your experience. I'd love to get some of that perspective.
Yeah. One of the very simple things I'll say is what we would really like as far as motivation. In the education system, one of the frustrating things is marks are such a crippling force on education. And if anyone's read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the dude in that book at one point decides he's not going to grade anything anymore. He's going to have this markless system, and so much better for education. And I get that totally. So students are being...
Although real quick, when you said marks, I was thinking Karl Marx. So I had to just catch up a little bit. You mean grades? Which is, again, just the US Canada translation. Only jumps in from time to time. Exactly. I was like, wait, where are we going now?
No, but cool. Our whole system really orient students towards grades, which is an external reward, there's something called the overcompensation hypothesis. When people are just focused on grades, they lose their internal motivation that really is powerful in learning. If you want to learn something, there's 2 or 3 answers to that. How can we increase that internal motivation? Number one, simple thing. If you really understand pedagogy, explain to students why you're doing what you're doing. If you're putting them through some process, make them understand what's in it for them. And I don't mean grades. What's in it for them in terms of their ability to be successful after they graduate. And so that's a simple part. Just take the time to say, there's a reason you're doing this, and here's what it is. And that helps. The other thing that I'm a big fan of is anything that makes the task you're asking them to do more what we call authentic. And an example, I'll give you an example of what I'm doing with my 1,600 student class this term. We connected with the Ontario government, the province that we're in, and they, of course, have e-learning for a lot of K-12s, and a lot of my students went through that in the spring and didn't really love their experience because it was e-learning 0.4 or something like that.
That was the other stampede that happened, was all these students who weren't ready were also dropped in there. So for sure.
And so what we said is, we got the ear of those people in the government who are informing e-learning. And we said, can we do the following for you from our class? I'm going to give the class some projects where they really learn about the science of learning. And then I'm going to put them in groups, and they are going to make a pitch. Here are some components that really should be in your future version of e-learning. And now they do a bunch of peer assessments, so we can take those 1,600 divided by 5, so we've got 300 or some groups.
Nice.
We pit them against each other, they assess each other, and that gives us a top 10.
Nice.
Who got a whole lot of feedback. And those top 10 can now revise their work, and now the government agency looks at those top 10.
It's almost like a hackathon, kind of.
It's like a hackathon, and they pick the top 3. The students are now engage right from the beginning. They
Yeah.
think my idea could be something that affects my younger brother or my
Right.
younger sister or
Right.
etc. And so just doing that, making their work have value instead of
Yeah.
we don't.
Hmm.
I think that's a really important way to engage and motivate as well.
Yeah. 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 It's one of the positive, and again, it's tough to talk silver linings when the pandemic's been as rough on really just about everyone, and some folks really in particular.
Yeah.
But the idea that there is an opportunity to bring more relevance to your instructional design,
Yeah.
in that there's more stuff that we all know is shared amongst everyone across the globe. One of the places where we're all coming back and we can recognize that shared experience is in online learning.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that responsibility that you have to some extent? Like 1600 is a big number, and those are a lot of humans. Just the law of big numbers means there's a good chunk of humans there who are really going through a very difficult time.
Yeah.
How do you handle that load, and how do you think about also managing yourself while you're really assuming this leadership position with that audience?
I was really like struck hard with that now with an interview I had with a student this week that he had asked if he could meet with me, and he was a Chinese student. And he said, getting into the University of Toronto was the dream of my life. And I had all this image that we can imagine the campus kind of life and everything. And then COVID hit. He never ended up coming to the campus at all. He's sitting in China, connecting on his computer, not having the clubs, not having the student interaction. And he says, this is not what I imagined. What should I do? And we were having this whole discussion about, for some students, it makes sense for them to take a break right now. In hopes that maybe in fall it is a more normal kind of existence. And this is it's really challenging to go from a K-12 system where you have a teacher that's there to a higher ed system. Normally, just a 1600 student higher ed system is a culture shock. But when it's now you on your own, it's especially. And so I think students have the challenge. They have so much distraction. They have procrastination to fight with, whereas they used to just be sitting in a chair. And now it's up to them to be in the chair, and nobody knows if they're not. So I'm seeing it in my students, and I'm trying to use it as an opportunity to teach them about anxiety and managing this whole idea of taking control of yourself and being in charge. So to some extent, that's what I see a potential of here is that for mental health, we used to talk about mental health like it was something that some people struggle with, whereas now we're all just living it every day. And the stigma thing is ridiculous. It's like, you're not anxious, you're not paying attention. Like, turn on the news for a while.
Exactly.
You should get anxious pretty soon. And so what is that? Why do you feel the way you do? And it turns out it's a very simple explanation. And then you can start thinking, okay, what are some ways I can control this and get myself feeling better? And there are some really clear strategies, none of which are therapy mojo. It's just simple things. Find what's something in your life that really makes you think of nothing else. When you're doing that thing, your head is totally there. Whatever that thing is, that's now medicine. And every now and then you should schedule some time in your day to pull your head away from everything else. Especially if that thing, by the way, is singing or dancing or aerobic activity. Those things actually make us feel in a very, very positive way. And so learning how to use the environment to put our mind in the place where we want it to be is a very useful skill. And so I hope this is an opportunity for a lot of our students to, it's a great challenge, but if we can help them through the challenge, and again, it always comes down to Vygotsky. It comes down to Vygotsky for the faculty too. Not expecting too much out of them from day one, letting them ease into this, what we sometimes call a 3-year journey to get a course online really set up properly. But of course, the students are going through those 3 years and getting just okay educational experiences while they have all these other challenges. So I really do feel for them. I think it's a really tough time to be a student.
It's also an interesting, when you were talking, it did make me think of the alternative too. Like when you maybe hold back for a year versus the formal education, when you think about the tools and resources that are available online now, where if you were to find the best track through open resources and MOOCs and lectures that are even available on YouTube, but frankly, frequently, there is some optimal path out there. It's just not, it's never connected yet in a coherent way to make the most efficient paths available. But you got to imagine that's something that's probably going to come down the road. Any thoughts on that?
There was a fantastic short story by Isaac Asimov back in the day, before the internet, before anything, but he had this conception of a student being curiosity driven, and then they would sit in front of some box, and I think he was imagining a television, but they would be able to go wherever they wanted to go. And the education system, all it suggested is you have to learn some stuff. You have to demonstrate some learning, but it's completely up to you to navigate. And it's almost like you're talking about. So none of this existed in his day.
Yeah.
But he already knew that's the way people like to learn. There's this notion called, problem-based learning, where you learn best when you're learning for a reason. There's something you're trying to solve. There's something you want to understand. I did a TEDx talk where I like to play a bit of guitar, and I bring a guitar with me that I built. That sounds nice. I bought the parts, I put them together, but that's how I wanted to learn about a guitar and what all the parts were. And that process, I learned so much about every piece of the guitar. And so I have to get a guitar neck. What guitar neck do I want? Well, what are my options? Why is one option better than another? And I would go piece by piece. And
it's very Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance of you. Yes.
and that's how you start to care about all those little bits that you're learning and how they fit together. And you end up with a really deep knowledge structure. I think we need to get there. We see, there's a graph in a book called Stratosphere by Michael Fullan, an educational theorist here from Canada. And he looks at the school system, K to 12, and enthusiasm for education. And in grades 3 and 4, it's way up there. But then they hit about grade 5 or 6, and it just drops. And when you look at that graph, it's something is not right. Learning should be fun. And so I think getting back to that learning fun, and can we do fun learning at scale? And I think we used to think those two things were impossible, but I'm not sure they are. I think they're becoming more and more possible. And I think that will be a good world when people can just show everything they've learned in a nice structured way, and yet still not be forced into a sort of a factory version of education.
It's funny. I've thus far failed in pushing the palindrome learning, which is fun while you're learning. Although I see there's some potential out there if you can have fun while you're learning, because it also makes it more salient. It's more emotionally resonant. And if you can activate
it's the frontal lobes, you feel fun makes you feel safe and secure, which is,
and
really
it's even
important.
more like the reptilian brain too, because the amygdala and like your sort of your pleasure centers. And I'm doing hand gestures for our listeners. They're gestures that they're not to scale. They're not actually reflecting anything about the brain. But yeah, any thoughts on that aspect too? Do you get into any of the neuroscience? And cognitive neuroscience is really interesting. Behavioral neuroscience, those spaces are super interesting. And it's one of the places where it feels like maybe we're about to make some breakthroughs on that front. So any thoughts there?
Well, I certainly think the learning sciences, psychology in general, but the learning sciences in specific, as our tools for watching the mind, anywhere from like EEG, where we can see electrical activity in the brain, to things like fMRI, where you can literally look at what parts of the brain are involved. We can certainly see, so if we want to know, does some variable have an impact? We can see it like never before. In fact, there's a lab at McMaster University where they have this beautiful theater, for lack of a better word, but the performer, who may be a musical performer but could be a professor, has an EEG cap on. And they're doing their thing. And then within the audience, there's chairs, every 5 or 6 chairs or something, where they also have an EEG cap on. And so they can put their cap on and collect data. And so now we have streaming data coming in from, say, 50 students and a professor. And you can look at things like, if there's something that the professor does that is important, what's the effect on him? What's the effect on the students? And so we can do some cool stuff. And with respect to engagement, for example, you're highlighting fun and you're bang on. Fun is really good. I did a chapter where I used the analogy riffs, getting back to guitar stuff, where it has to either be relevant, the students see why it matters to them, or interesting, which is a harder one to define sometimes, but I'll come back to it in a sec. Fun or social. Those relevant, interesting, fun, or social, those are things that really create a positive learning atmosphere. And interesting, just to give you a taste, I saw a guy do this so well. He was a physics prof, and I'm not naturally inclined to physics, but he gave some problem of a ball rolling over a surface and where is it going to end? And he had multiple choice, and he started the lecture by saying, okay, what do you all think? Vote. And we all voted. And he said, you're all wrong. And I'm not going to tell you why you're right. I'm going to give you this whole lecture, and by the end of the lecture, you should know what the right answer is. But by starting that thing and getting people like, what? I'm sure I was right. What the heck is wrong?
Right.
And so he piques curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
which is making the subsequent lecture interesting.
Yeah.
And so learning a few of these little things can go a long way to
Yeah.
keep students from looking at their cell phones. And I think
Yeah.
that is, especially online,
Mm-hmm.
we got to look at our competition. It's almost back to the interview. You are one stream of information, but they're staring at a box that gives them all this other stream of information. And if
Right.
you're not doing what all those other things are doing, which is, pulling their attention back now and then and
Exactly.
using various devices, then you're going to get lost.
Yeah, I've always viewed it as almost like this existential struggle between learning and marketing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're not that different. Learning is more learner-centered generally in terms of the objectives, where marketing is more for the organization who's trying to develop a market. But they're basically tactics that they improve your storytelling, they build suspense. There are emotional returns really throughout the experience. The way Pixar manipulates your emotions and you appreciate it. There's an artfulness to storytelling and narrative and all of those things. How about on the storytelling piece? Because I know you're a lecturer.
So we do a bit of a funny story that way. So at some point, I'd been lecturing for a while and I'd won some awards for lecturing, and I got this phone call from this company called The Great Courses. You might know about them in the States. I'd never heard of them. And they're like, oh, you're going to come down and do a lecture series with us, and you'll just have checks show up every now and then. That sounds good.
You had me at checks come in all the time. Yeah.
And they said, but the first thing is, we have to teach you how to teach. Ooh. And it was interesting. So I thought you selected me because I was known as a great teacher. And they said, yeah, that's where we start. And now we teach you how to teach. And so I had to go down there. And the first thing, I ended up creating a 24 lecture series on memory.
Wow.
But the first thing they endorsed, even in that day, was these lectures shouldn't be any more than a half an hour.
Yeah.
And they should maybe even 25 minutes, half an hour. And they should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're about one thing. It's a story that encapsulates it all. Bring in some human element. If you can tell us about a human story that relates to what you're doing. And I realized at that point that what I had been doing and what so many professors do is they walk into class and go, blah, 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 blah. Oh, time's up. We'll continue tomorrow. And so they just stop wherever they stop and then they continue. And it's this 12-week story.
Right.
You cannot hang on to a 12-week story.
Right.
But they can hang on to a half an hour. And if you include even 5 or 6 important bits of information in that, they can get those 5 or 6 important bits, and that's enough. Let them go and consolidate that and walk away, and then bring them back and see if you can tell a new story.
Or end with a cliffhanger, because of a pupil of Zygarnik was a pupil of Vygotsky. Which, and that's the idea that we remember incomplete things more than completed ones. But all these things to me come back to just a good foundation in some well-researched, well-established psychological knowledge that just needs to be translated into something that is relevant. And then also, again, coming back.
You just defined our lab, by the way.
Really?
Exactly. Go out and find that knowledge that's out there in the literature, but is just sitting in some research journal.
Yeah.
Let's mobilize this. Let's find a way to get it out there and used. Yeah.
And it just feels like right now is this massive, unprecedented learning laboratory writ large has just launched. It's more in the heat of the moment. Are people even documenting what they're doing, paying enough attention? People are just trying to get through their days, which is why I guess there is a community around centers for learning and teaching that may be far enough ahead of this. Coming back to our Cinderella story as we get closer to the end, there's the once upon a time, this is the happily ever after part, maybe, is that if we could look to them a little more for guidance through this. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, and there's even maybe a meta level. So if you're at a big university, your center of teaching and learning is your friend. You may not know it yet, but if you get connected with them, there's so much knowledge, so much guidance, and not just the pedagogical knowledge, but also the knowledge about how to break it to you. Prioritizing what you should know when you should know it, so they don't overwhelm you. So they're very good at, that's what they do all the time. For places that might not have that, or we're just seeing this generally. There's also a desire to go up another level. So there's a platform called 1HE, for example, higher ed. It's UK based, but their goal, they're really laser focused now on this idea that there's new teachers, or at least teachers new to e-learning. Let's get a bunch of resources up there and a community up there,
Yeah.
so that when you join, no matter where you are, you can share this knowledge with each other. So we see some pockets of those, and I'm hoping these pockets get together and join forces, and so that there's one obvious place that's really, presenting the information well.
Yeah.
And I think we are going to see more of that.
Yeah.
And I hope we even see institutions say, welcome to our institution. Here's a resource. You've got a free account over there. And if there's even a training program, this is my pet peeve. I'll go to my pet peeve here.
Yeah.
For at least most professors, half of our job is research, half of our job is teaching. Graduate school is all about teaching us how to do research. Mm-hmm. We're not taught how to teach.
Yeah.
We're not taught the theory of teaching.
Yeah.
And then we're just thrown into a classroom. And so I think that's a shame. I think we should be expected to at least learn the basics, have an idea of the role that different things play, from assessment to lecture presentation that we're talking about.
Right.
They can ultimately find their own style.
Mm-hmm.
They should at least be introduced to the problem space and some of the relevant things they should be thinking about when they figure out what works for them.
Yeah.
So I think we'll formalize that a little bit more. I think we need to, both for the faculty and especially for the students now.
Yeah.
We need to up our game. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the idea of teaching as a craft, and online teaching in particular as a really critical component of that craft. Because there are people who are better at in-person teaching. There actually are people who are better at online. Yep. And then when you were talking about class sizes, some skills and competencies and approaches work better in different online contexts. And then same thing about peer-to-peer. But hopefully we'll continue to evolve this conversation to have deeper dives into some of this stuff and try to develop a community that can have these types of conversations. It's just hard to navigate these days. It's difficult to find the Sherpas, the senseis. I'm watching Cobra Kai right now on Netflix, which is taking me back to the Karate Kid of my youth. But we're coming up on time. Steve, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time here. Folks want to learn more about anything you're doing. You mentioned the MOOC that you just created. Is there anywhere that folks should go or they should look to find out more about what we talked about?
Sure. I've got a couple of courses on Coursera.org. So Coursera.org.
Yeah.
So one is just an intro to psych course if anybody wants to relive their intro to psych. But the more recent one is called Mind Control, which sounds ominous. But Mind Control, Managing Anxiety Around COVID-19. So it's really about learning how to control your own mind.
Wow.
So that you can, and we get a bunch of tips, bunch of strategies, and all kinds of stuff there. So people can go there. If there happens to be, I don't know if we reach any of this, but if there's police officers out there, we've also created a course to help police officers manage their stress, because there's a lot of stress there, and we're doing one for healthcare workers now. So we're getting out there trying to help the community and give them some tools. Yeah, I think about 140,000 have been through that mind control course so far. So it's pretty amazing. And
cool for some reason you had me at mind control, Steve. I'm not sure. I just
the Jedi version too.
Exactly.
Yoda keeps popping up in that course.
Yeah. So before we let you go, I always love to ask my guests what's emerging. Anything new, exciting beyond what we just talked about that's capturing your imagination? You're someone who sees a lot of stuff. I'd love to get a little bit of perspective from you.
Yeah, I think the challenges we have now when we think student-centric are helping them engage. So you mentioned things like the Zeigarnik effect, and I actually recommend things to students like, don't watch the whole lecture and then stop. Watch 45 minutes of a 60-minute and stop there, and then come back 15 and start the next one. Yeah. And it seems silly, but then you watch TV and they're constantly Zeigarnik affecting us.
Oh my God.
Masked Singer, I pick whatever. Oh, commercial. So if it works there, it works here. And so I think we all have to learn how to be more engaging, how to compete with the other media. Mm-hmm. But of course, the other side, and I'm just going to echo what I said earlier, but I really do think it's the critical thing. We have to get serious about skills, and to the point where I think we have to find ways to measure them on the fly and accreditate them like we do knowledge learning. And I've got some ideas of how to do that. I've got a chapter where we talk about an idea that we then tested out with research. And I think that's where I'm hoping to see universities go. I also am pretty sure that we're going to see universities change the way they interact with the EdTech world. Because of privacy and security concerns, they're going to have to get more central. They're not going to be able to let a prof just pick a technology. Yeah. And when they get more central, my hope is that they, become more friendly to pitches, that they have an attitude like guitar players do at the NAMM festival. Show me what's out there. What could I be using?
Yeah.
Come pitch your thing to me if it's cool. But that they should also have a really firm pedagogical criterion. They should say, hey, listen, this is our goals. This is what we want to provide for our students. So come tell me about your tech or your idea, but attach it to those goals. I want to know how it's going to help us up our game. And if you can sell us that way, if you can sell us that you're going to help us make our students more successful, then we want to hear it. And I think universities will be building toolboxes, and then they'll be able to inform their faculty well. And I think that'll be part of the path of getting that sort of culture within a university of common knowledge developed. So I think that'll be a big trend we're going to see.
Awesome. Fantastic stuff. Steve Joordens, Joordens, Joordens.
Yep.
And once you Google that, Steve's well known enough that you'll find a lot of his stuff there. So that's also a good way to go. But the mind control course on Coursera, I may need to do my homework, learn some mind control, and have you back on to talk more about that. But Steve, it's wonderful having you. Thanks so much for joining.
Cool. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And for our listeners, thanks to you, as always, for listening. If you like what you're hearing, tell your friends, subscribe, share it. We'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.